The first gunshots of that fateful morning in 1876 were what finally drove Olivia Campbell through the doors of Willow Creek's only saloon, a place she'd sworn never to enter. Her hands trembled as she pulled her tattered shawl tighter around her shoulders, scanning the dimly lit room for anyone who might help a desperate woman with nowhere else to turn. Olivia had not smiled in nearly 3 years, not since the day she buried her husband and infant son after the typhoid swept through their homestead. The townsfolk called her too sad to smile behind her back, though never to her face. They offered pitying glances but little else as she struggled to maintain the small plot of land that was all she had left in this world. Now even that was threatened. The banker, Mr. Hargrove, had given her until sundown to vacate the same property that still bore the 2 small crosses near the old oak tree that she visited every Sunday after church. She had nowhere to go, no family back east to take her in, and nothing but the clothes on her back and a few precious mementos tucked into her carpet bag. "Ain't proper for a lady to be in here alone," the bartender called out, eyeing her suspiciously. "Especially not at this hour." "I'm looking for someone who might help me," Olivia said, her voice barely audible above the clinking of glasses and murmured conversations that had momentarily paused at her entrance. "Ain't we all, miss? Ain't we all?" The bartender shook his head and returned to polishing a glass with a rag that looked almost as dirty as the glass itself. In the far corner of the saloon, a man sat alone, his hat pulled low over his eyes. Unlike the other patrons, he hadn't turned to gawk at the unexpected female visitor. His attention remained fixed on the cards he was shuffling methodically between weathered hands. Something about his stillness made Olivia approach his table despite her better judgment. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly. "I wonder if I might have a word." The man looked up, and Olivia found herself staring into the most striking blue eyes she'd ever seen, set in a face tanned by years under the harsh western sun. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense. His nose had clearly been broken at least once, and a scar ran along his jawline, but there was something in his gaze that made her breath catch. "Madam," he said, tipping his hat slightly, "I'm afraid I'm not much for conversation. I only need a moment of your time. I'm in dire circumstances and require assistance of a particular nature." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Don't we all?" He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit before you fall. You look like you haven't eaten in days." Olivia sank into the chair, suddenly aware of how her legs trembled beneath her skirts. "My name is Olivia Campbell. She corrected herself. "I owned a small homestead just outside of town. The bank is foreclosing today, and I have reason to believe Mr. Hargrove has unlawful designs on my property." "Yancy Addison," the man replied, sliding his deck of cards into his vest pocket. "And Hargrove's been pulling that trick for years. Running good folks off their land so his railroad friends can buy it cheap." He studied her for a long moment. "You're the widow, the one they say is too sad to smile." Heat rushed to Olivia's cheeks. "People talk too much in small towns." "That they do." Yancy signaled to the bartender. "Bring the lady some coffee and whatever food you've got back there that won't kill her." He turned back to Olivia. "Now tell me exactly what's happened." As the hot coffee arrived bitter but blessedly strong, Olivia explained how Hargrove had suddenly claimed her husband had taken out an additional loan before his death, one she knew nothing about. With no way to prove otherwise and no funds to pay it, she was being forced out. "And what exactly do you expect me to do about it, Mrs. Campbell?" Yancy asked when she'd finished. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've tried everything else. The sheriff says it's a civil matter. The pastor offered prayers but no practical help. I thought perhaps. I've heard there are men who solve problems for a price." Yancy's expression hardened. "I'm not a gun for hire if that's what you're asking." "No, I would never," she took a steadying breath. "I only thought you might know the law better than I do. Or perhaps know someone who could help me prove the loan documents are forgeries." "What makes you think I'd know anything about such matters?" Nothing specific. You don't look like you belong here any more than I do." Olivia lowered her eyes. "I apologize for the imposition. I'll find another way." As she rose to leave, Yancy's hand shot out, catching her wrist. His touch was gentle but firm. "Sit down, Mrs. Campbell. I didn't say I wouldn't help. I just wanted to be clear about what kind of help I'm offering." He released her wrist. "I was a lawman once, back in Kansas. I know a thing or two about banking fraud. Let me see what I can find out." Relief washed over Olivia like a cool rain after months of drought. "I can't pay you much. We'll worry about that later. For now, eat something. You look like a strong wind might blow you away." She obediently took a bite of the stew the bartender had brought, surprised to find it was actually quite good. "Why would you help a stranger, especially one with nothing to offer in return?" Yancy leaned back in his chair, studying her face. "Let's just say I've got my reasons. Besides," his voice softened almost imperceptibly, "your sadness speaks to me, Mrs. Campbell. There's strength in carrying on when everything's been taken from you. I respect that. Most people just find it uncomfortable to be around." "Most people are fools," he replied simply. "Now finish that food. We've got work to do before sundown if you want to sleep in your own bed tonight." For the first time in longer than she could remember, Olivia felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't happiness. She wasn't sure she remembered what that felt like, but it was something other than the crushing despair that had been her constant companion. They left the saloon together, ignoring the curious stares of the other patrons. Outside, the sun was high in the cloudless sky, promising another scorching summer day. Yancy led her to where his horse was tethered, a magnificent black stallion that towered over Olivia. "This is Thunder," Yancy said, patting the horse's neck. "He doesn't take to many people, but I think he'll make an exception for you." As if understanding, Thunder gently nudged Olivia's shoulder with his nose. Despite herself, she reached up to stroke his velvety muzzle. "He's beautiful," she murmured. "That he is. Now, first stop is the land office. I want to see those documents myself." Yancy helped her mount behind him, and Olivia hesitantly placed her hands at his waist. It had been so long since she'd touched another person, and the contact made her acutely aware of how isolated she'd become in her grief. "Hold tight," he warned as Thunder began to move. "He's got a powerful stride." Olivia tightened her grip, feeling the solid warmth of Yancy through his cotton shirt. For the briefest moment, she closed her eyes and allowed herself to remember what it felt like to be protected, to not carry the weight of her troubles alone. The land office was a small, nondescript building at the edge of town. Inside, a bespectacled clerk looked up from his ledger with obvious annoyance at being disturbed. "We're here about the Campbell property," Yancy said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I'd like to see the loan documents." The clerk's eyes darted nervously between them. "That's confidential bank business. I can't just—" "You can and you will," Yancy interrupted, leaning across the counter. "Unless you'd prefer I fetch the federal marshal to discuss how property transfers work in this county." Something in Yancy's manner must have convinced the clerk, because he hurriedly pulled a file from a nearby cabinet. "These are copies of all documents pertaining to that property," he said, pushing them across the counter. Yancy spread the papers out, examining each one carefully. Olivia watched his face, trying to decipher his thoughts from his expression. "Just as I suspected," he finally said, tapping one document. "Look at the signature on the original deed and then look at this so-called loan agreement." Olivia peered at where he pointed. Her husband's signature on the loan looked similar enough at first glance, but examining it more closely, she could see subtle differences in the way the letters were formed. "It's not his handwriting," she whispered. "I knew Thomas never took out another loan." "No, he didn't." Yancy gathered the papers. "And I'd bet my last dollar Hargrove didn't expect anyone to look this closely. He's gotten sloppy." "What do we do now?" Olivia asked. "Now we pay Mr. Hargrove a visit." The bank was situated on Main Street, its grand facade designed to inspire confidence among the townsfolk. As they entered, Heads turned at the unusual sight of the notorious Widow Campbell and the mysterious stranger who'd ridden into town just days ago. Hargrove himself emerged from his office at the commotion, his florid face darkening when he spotted Olivia. "Mrs. Campbell, I believe I was quite clear this morning. You have until sunset to vacate your property." "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Yancy said smoothly, stepping forward. "Mrs. Campbell's husband never took out that second loan, and who might you be?" Hargrove sneered. "Someone who knows a forged signature when he sees one." Yancy placed the documents on the counter. "I've telegraphed an old friend at the U.S. Marshal's office. He's quite interested in banking practices in Willow Creek, should be arriving on tomorrow's train." The color drained from Hargrove's face. "Now see here, no, you see here." Yancy's voice dropped to a dangerous murmur. "You're going to tear up that fraudulent loan agreement, and you're going to leave Mrs. Campbell alone, or I'll make it my personal mission to see you behind bars." A tense silence fell over the bank. Even the tellers had stopped their work to watch the confrontation. "This is outrageous," Hargrove blustered, though with noticeably less conviction. "You have no authority. Actually, I do." Yancy reached into his vest and pulled out a badge that glinted in the afternoon light. "I may not wear this openly anymore, but it's still valid." "Now, what's it going to be, Hargrove? Do we handle this quietly, or do I start asking questions about the other properties you've seized recently?" Hargrove's eyes darted around the room, taking in the watching customers and employees. With a barely suppressed snarl, he snatched the loan document and tore it in half. "This isn't over," he hissed. "Oh, I think it is," Yancy replied calmly. "And just to be sure, I'll be staying at Mrs. Campbell's property for a few days, to help with repairs, you understand." Olivia looked at Yancy in surprise, but kept silent as he placed a protective hand at the small of her back and guided her out of the bank. "You're a marshal?" she asked once they were outside. He corrected. "I left the service last year, but Hargrove doesn't need to know that." He helped her back onto Thunder. "And I hope you don't mind my presumption about staying at your place. I thought it might discourage any further attempts to intimidate you." "I'm grateful for the offer," Olivia said, meaning it. The thought of returning alone to her isolated homestead had filled her with dread. "But I have nothing to offer in return for your help." Yancy turned in the saddle to look at her, his expression unreadable. "Sometimes, Mrs. Campbell, helping someone carry their burden is payment enough." They rode in silence back to Olivia's homestead, a modest cabin with a small barn and corral set against the backdrop of rolling prairie. It was humble, but had once been filled with love and the promise of a future. Now it stood as a reminder of all she had lost. As they dismounted, Yancy surveyed the property. "You've kept it up well, considering." "I try," Olivia said simply. "The garden still produces enough to keep me fed, and I sell eggs in town when the hens are laying well. It's a good piece of land." Yancy led Thunder to the corral. "I can see why Hargrove wanted it." Inside the cabin, Olivia moved about lighting lamps against the gathering dusk. The small space was neat but sparse, with few personal touches beyond a framed family portrait on the mantel and a child's wooden horse on a shelf. "I'll make us some supper," she said, grateful to have a task to focus on. "It's not much, but I'm sure it's better than what I've been eating on the trail," Yancy assured her. He moved to the fireplace, adding wood to the banked coals and stoking them back to life. The domestic scene struck Olivia as strangely comforting, having another person in the house. The sounds of movement and conversation after so many silent meals alone. As they ate a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and wild greens from her garden, Olivia found herself watching Yancy's hands, strong, capable hands that handled both gun and coffee cup with equal ease. "You said you were a marshal," she ventured. "What made you leave?" Yancy was quiet for so long that Olivia thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was different, stripped of its usual confidence. "I failed to protect someone I'd sworn to keep safe." He set down his fork. "My sister and her husband were witnesses in a case against a cattle rustling ring. I promised them they'd be safe in my custody. I was wrong." "I'm sorry," Olivia said softly, recognizing the familiar shadow of grief that passed over his features. "It was 2 years ago." "I resigned my badge the next day." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "I know something about sadness, Mrs. Campbell, about carrying it like a weight you can never put down." "Olivia," she said impulsively. "Please call me Olivia." "Olivia," he repeated, and something in the way he said her name made her heart beat just a little faster. "You should know I wasn't entirely honest earlier when I said your sadness speaks to me. What I meant was that I recognize it. We're kindred spirits in that way, I suppose." "The sadness becomes part of you after a while," she agreed, "like a limb you never asked for but have learned to live with." "Yes," he nodded slowly, "but sometimes I've found it can also be a source of strength. Your sadness is what's kept you fighting for this place when others might have given up. It anchors you to the memories you're afraid to lose." His understanding startled her. For years, well-meaning neighbors had urged her to move on and find happiness again, as if grief were a choice rather than a condition of her existence. "No one has ever put it quite like that before," she admitted. "Your sadness is not a weakness, Olivia. In its own way, it's your strength." Yancy's gaze was steady. "And I admire that about you." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, or the beginnings of trust. Olivia felt a strange lightness in her chest, as if a tiny piece of the burden she'd carried for so long had been lifted. That night, she insisted Yancy take the bed while she made a pallet by the fireplace. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her. She lay awake, listening to the familiar creaks of the cabin and the new, unfamiliar sound of another person's breathing. It was comforting in a way she hadn't expected. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Olivia rose early, as was her habit, to feed the chickens and tend to her small garden before the worst heat of the day set in. To her surprise, she found Yancy already outside, repairing a section of fence that had been listing for months. "You don't have to do that," she called, approaching with a mug of coffee in each hand. Yancy straightened, wiping sweat from his brow despite the early hour. "Idle hands make for a troubled mind," he said, accepting the coffee gratefully. Besides, it needed doing. "There's a lot around here that needs doing," Olivia admitted. "I try to keep up, but it's too much for one person," Yancy finished. "No shame in that. A homestead is meant for a family, for many hands sharing the work." The casual reminder of all she had lost might once have sent Olivia retreating into herself, but today she found she could bear it. Yes, Thomas had such dreams for this place. He was going to plant an orchard over there. She pointed to an open stretch of land beyond the garden. "Apple trees," he said, "for cider and pies." "It's good land for it," Yancy observed. "South-facing slope, good drainage. You know about orchards? My father was an apple farmer back in New York State, before he got gold fever and dragged us all west." A hint of a smile played around his lips. "I spent my boyhood pruning and grafting when all I wanted was to ride horses and play at being a gunslinger. Funny how life turns out." They fell into a companionable silence, drinking their coffee as the sun rose higher. It was strange, Olivia thought, how quickly Yancy had slipped into the rhythms of her daily life, as if there had always been a space for him there. Over the next few days, a pattern emerged. They would work side by side during the daylight hours, Yancy tackling the heavier repairs while Olivia tended to her usual chores. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sun set over the prairie while Yancy told stories of his days as a marshal or Olivia shared memories of her life before tragedy struck. It was during one such evening, nearly a week after their first meeting, that Olivia found herself studying Yancy's profile in the fading light. The hard lines of his face had softened somewhat in the days he'd spent at her homestead. Or perhaps, she realized, she was simply seeing beyond the weathered exterior to the man beneath. "Why are you really helping me, Yancy?" she asked suddenly. "And don't say it's just because of Hargrove's forgery. You could have handled that and moved on days ago." Yancy was silent for a long moment, gazing out at the darkening landscape. "When I first saw you in that saloon," he finally said, "you reminded me of myself after I lost my sister, walking through the world but not really in it, a ghost among the living." He turned to face her. But there was something else there too, a determination, a refusal to surrender despite everything. He reached out hesitantly and took her hand in his. "I stayed because I wanted to see if that spark could be fanned back into a flame. Because your sadness called to mine, and for the first time in 2 years, I felt like maybe there was a purpose to my wandering." Olivia's heart hammered in her chest. Yancy's thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand, sending unexpected shivers up her arm. "I don't know if I can ever be what I was before," she whispered. "The woman who laughed easily and believed in happy endings died along with Thomas and our son." "I'm not asking you to be what you were," Yancy said softly, "only to consider that you might still become something new. That we both might." The next morning, Olivia woke to find Yancy already gone from his usual spot on the porch where he'd taken to sleeping despite her protests. Panic fluttered in her chest had he left without saying goodbye. Had she revealed too much of her fragile heart the night before? But then she heard voices outside, and peering through the window, she saw Yancy talking to another man on horseback. The stranger wore a badge that caught the morning sun. Olivia quickly dressed and stepped outside just as the marshal was riding away. "What was that about?" she asked, anxiety creeping back into her voice. "Just making sure Hargrove gets the message," Yancy said, turning toward her. "Marshal Johnson is an old friend. He'll be keeping an eye on things around here, making sure no one tries to force you off your land again. You're leaving, aren't you?" The words escaped before she could stop them. Yancy's expression softened. "I was thinking about it," he admitted. "I've stayed longer than I intended already." "Of course," Olivia said quickly, embarrassed by her outburst. "You've done more than enough." "I couldn't ask you to, but then I realized something," Yancy continued as if she hadn't spoken. "I haven't had nightmares since I've been here. For 2 years I've woken up in a cold sweat almost every night seeing my sister's face, but not here, not with you." He took a step closer. "I'm not saying I'm cured or that you are. Some wounds never fully heal, but maybe they hurt less when shared with someone who understands." Olivia felt tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know how to do this," she confessed. "How to let someone new into my life when I still love them so much." "You don't have to stop loving them," Yancy said gently. "Love isn't a finite resource, Olivia. Your heart can expand to hold both what was and what might be." He reached out, brushing a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "I'm not asking for promises, just for time. Time to see if what I feel growing between us could take root and flourish." "And what if it doesn't?" Olivia asked, though she already knew her own heart's answer. In the span of a week, this man had awakened feelings she'd thought buried forever. "Then I'll ride away knowing I at least tried to live again instead of just surviving." Yancy's hand lingered on her face. "But I don't think that's going to happen." Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his head until his lips met hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning, a promise rather than a demand. And for the first time in 3 long years, Olivia felt something bloom in her chest that wasn't pain. When they finally parted, Yancy rested his forehead against hers. "Stay with me," he murmured. "Let me help you carry your sadness until it doesn't feel so heavy anymore." "And I'll help carry yours," Olivia promised, her voice stronger than it had been in years. As summer turned to fall and fall to winter, the homestead began to transform. Yancy repaired the barn and expanded the corral, adding 3 more horses to keep Thunder company. Olivia's garden flourished under their combined care, and she began selling preserves and baked goods in town alongside her eggs. The townsfolk who had once whispered about the sad widow Campbell now spoke with surprise about the change in her. She still didn't smile often, but when she did, usually when Yancy was near, it transformed her face completely. On a crisp morning in early spring, Yancy took Olivia to the south-facing slope she'd once pointed out to him. "I have something to show you," he said, leading her to where dozens of small saplings stood in neat rows, their branches still bare but showing the first buds of the season. "Apple trees," Olivia breathed, kneeling to touch one of the small trunks. "When did you?" "I ordered them back in the fall, had them shipped from my father's old orchard in New York." Yancy knelt beside her. "I know they won't replace the ones Thomas wanted to plant, but I thought maybe they could be the beginning of something new, something ours." Olivia turned to him, her eyes shining with tears that for once weren't born of sorrow. "They're perfect," she whispered. "There's something else." Yancy reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. "I'm not asking you to forget, Olivia. I would never ask that. But I am asking if you might find room in your heart to build a new life alongside the memories of the old one." For a moment, Olivia closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel the presence of Thomas and their son not as a crushing weight of grief, but as a gentle benediction. When she opened her eyes again, she saw Yancy watching her with such tenderness that her heart seemed to expand in her chest. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you." They were wed in the small church in Willow Creek as the apple blossoms opened, filling the air with their sweet fragrance. The same townsfolk who had once avoided Olivia's gaze now filled the pews, witnessing the unlikely union of the widow too sad to smile and the former lawman who'd found in her sadness a reflection of his own, and in that reflection, a path toward healing. As Yancy slipped the ring onto her finger, he whispered words meant only for her. "Your sadness will always be a part of you and mine of me, but it no longer defines us. It's just one thread in the tapestry we're weaving together." And when Olivia smiled at him, a real smile that reached her eyes and illuminated her entire being, he knew it was true. Their shared griefs hadn't vanished, but they had transformed, becoming not just bearable but valuable, a reminder of their capacity to love deeply, lose profoundly, and still find the courage to love again. That night, as they stood on the porch of what was now their home, watching the stars emerge one by one above the young orchard, Olivia leaned against Yancy's solid warmth. "Do you think they would approve?" she asked softly. "Thomas and our son, your sister." "I do," Yancy said without hesitation. "They loved us. They would want us to live fully, not just survive." He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and together they gazed out at the land that had once been only a reminder of loss, but now held the promise of a future neither had dared to imagine. "From sadness to strength," Olivia murmured, repeating the words Yancy had once said to her. "I never thought I would feel whole again. Not the same kind of whole," Yancy acknowledged, "but maybe a different kind, one with scars and missing pieces, but whole nonetheless." As the years passed, the homestead flourished. The apple orchard produced its first fruits, sweet and tart in equal measure. Children's laughter once again filled the cabin, two daughters with Yancy's blue eyes and Olivia's gentle spirit, and a son who arrived unexpectedly when they'd thought their family complete. And if sometimes Olivia still visited the two crosses beneath the old oak tree, or if Yancy occasionally rode alone to the ridge overlooking the valley where he could speak to the sister he couldn't save, it was understood between them. Their sadness had become not a burden, but a foundation, the solid ground upon which they had built something beautiful, enduring, and entirely their own.